Hi, everyone. Well, this is our final session. I'm another survivor of doctoral study with Nigel. It was his Religious Voices in Public Places edited volume in 2007-8, something like that, which drew his work to my attention. I was then the religion correspondent for the BBC World Service, and I'm very grateful for the risk you took on a journalist used to summarising things in a few hundred words, desperately then trying to adjust to the scale of doctoral study. But I'm always grateful, Nigel, for the way that you combined the exacting approach to precision, which has been well rehearsed over the last few days, with your genuine pastoral concern alongside Ginny for the flourishing of the community of students, and the reading parties in Northumberland or on the south coast, which I enjoyed, and I know others here also did, were very memorable, so thank you. Gregory is our speaker today, and I will hand over to him now.
This conference honors Nigel Bigger's efforts to do Christian ethics from the ground up, as we've heard, resisting abstraction and insularity, leaning a bit more into the political side of political theology and the ethics side of Christian ethics. If Jeremy Waldron has called for political theory, reminding us there's life after and beyond John Rawls, Nigel has called for a political theology, reminding us there's life after and beyond Karl Barth. I've been asked to consider themes of nationalism and internationalism in light of upheavals in both the UK and the US, presumably the populist upheavals named Trump and Brexit, widely seen as at least partially responsive to the neglect of local attachments and a sense of place by technocratic cosmopolitan elites wedded to financial deregulation, economic globalization, and supranational political integration. I'm dissatisfied with the public conversation of our topic, as well as its treatment in academic theology, both of which tend to collapse the history of nations into the history of nationalisms. My admittedly speculative proposal to recover a stronger sense of Gentile identity, which elevates hotly debated issues in post-supersessionist theology and biblical studies, related to what Karl Barth called the differentiated unity of Jew and Gentile, may at first blush appear less from the ground up than our organizers had hoped. To be sure, I doubt I need to motivate practical concern for debates about the idea of a nation, especially those negotiating tensions between liberal democracy, international legal order, and the need for national belonging. They are readily apparent in controversial debates over immigration, public education, racism, religious liberty, national symbols, collective memory, foreign policy, the very issues where Nigel's unapologetic confession of British patriotism that we heard about last night stirs trouble. On the ground, perhaps unlike in Britain, given what Nigel has called an Anglican liberal ethos, sociologists point to a major restructuring right now in American religion, emerging from empirical investigation of a nativist, anti-democratic, authoritarian, ethno-cultural phenomena that merges Christian and American identity, estimated to be about 20% of Americans, threatening hard-won traditions of equal citizenship that protects minority rights. Some speak of ethnic Christianism, ethno-traditionalism, or even post-Christian Christian nationalism, with analogies to a Europeanization of American Christianity, or what Rogers Brubaker has called civilizationalist religion, the kind of thing that solicits a familiar Augustinian suspicion of civil religion in favor of the true religion of the heavenly city. Nationalism, to the extent it consecrates death with false transcendence and false solidarity, is the real threat to religion and private conscience. Augustine's relentlessly negative position on civil religion as a Roman political thinker is now being rethought, just as other scholars have pointed to the unappreciated radical implications of Robert Bella's thesis on American civil religion. Namely, civil religion is not simply a benign analogy, something like a religion, with quaint rituals of Super Bowl Sunday or President Biden's consistent appeal to the soul of the nation, but actually a religious formation or deformation an imaginary otherworldliness of whiteness, one nation under God. This racialized violence is central to recent sociological studies, like Taking America Back for God and The Flag and the Cross, both published by Oxford in the past years, argue that it has become the dominant framework for perceptions of religion in American public life, a significant factor in the so-called Great Abdicating, the precipitous decline in church affiliation among young adults in the United States. A politics of liberal internationalism that values the life world of nations, albeit not absolutely, was once hailed as a great contribution of Jewish and Christian theological imagination, worked out concretely in early modern international law and mid-20th century transnational social movements, hoping to defend a universal human community while recognizing cultural specificity, often by way of a Grotian sweet spot between Hobbesian realism and Kantian idealism. Today, with the global crisis of political legitimacy, party states, neo-Ottomanism, Hindu constitutionalism, Islamicism, not to mention questions about liberal democracy, many questions have been brought to this legacy. If Christian ethics is to be from the ground up, it must at some point go up, as it were, and deploy the whole vocabulary of biblical and theological discourse, including the potentially embarrassing ethnic reasoning and stubbornly realist genealogical thinking of that discourse that brings Gentile nations, by adoption, into Israel's redemptive history through Christ by way of his Spirit. Or at least that is my primary goal, to defend liberal internationalism, but less by way of political theory or sociology or generic patriotism, and more by way of a resignified biblical theology of a plurality of Gentile peoples, a resource that Nigel does not seem to pursue in his own account. What to a Christian is a nation? My answer reflects something of a change in my views and is liable to be misunderstood as some retrograde retrieval of the sources of our trouble. But I'm motivated by a sense for all the attention to resurgent Christian nationalism, both in the United States and elsewhere, and calls for contextual theologies of various kinds of our nested identities. Theological analysis of national identity has been rather thin. Most scholarly work on nationalism we owe to historians and sociologists and political scientists, even literature departments. Beyond warnings against the idolatry of religious nationalism, affirmation of a transnational church, and calls to regard no human person as alien, with consistent appeals to Galatians 3:28 and Luke 10, the parable of the Good Samaritan, as paradigmatic biblical passages of our cosmopolitan age that transcends boundaries for a global common good, a global neighborhood, to quote recent encyclicals, theologians have been rather opaque, if not timid, in asking who are the nations, the ethne, the goyim, the peoples, for us today. At least those of us who confess faith in the covenant-making, relational God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Much ink has been spilled by Christian ethicists on liberalism, church and state, church and world, the universal, the particular, human rights, rightly ordered loves, duties to strangers, collective responsibility for structural injustice. But there's been less focused attention on national identity, a topic that preoccupied not only much of 19th and 20th century theology, but many late antique and early medieval theologians, wrestling with their new social and political reality after the dissolution of the Roman Empire, fitting their world into the biblical drama of Israel and the nations, making sense of the gentes of the post-Roman West, living in what Peter Brown has aptly described as micro-Christendoms, where particular identities were seen as diverse incarnations of the Church Universal, rather than a uniform populus Christianus. If Oliver O'Donovan has asked us to reconsider the witness of Christendom, perhaps we must also reconsider the witness of these Gentile micro-Christendoms. There's a lot of nation talk in the Bible, but in her work on Karl Barth and nationalism, Welsh theologian Caris Mosley has pointed out that contemporary theologians tend to feel safer in the wake of Barth's attack on Nazi ideology and the disgracing of Heidegger with the concept of the state rather than the concept of nationhood, which they tend to associate with ontological accounts. But even without the spooky metaphysics, Even patriotism has been thought, in the words of Reinhold Niebuhr, to be, from an absolute perspective, simply another form of selfishness. Though Niebuhr, a fierce critic of American exceptionalism, also argued that what lies beyond the nation was too vague to inspire devotion, and gave a case for nationalist democracies that require shared communal identity. I read Nigel's 2014 book, Between Kin and Cosmopolis, as a foreshadowing provocation against this stream. Drawing from an array of Anglican thinkers, he argues that nations secure goods for which it's appropriate to respond with conditional piety. Nations, he tells us, are morally significant facts, not just political ones. A nation, he writes, incarnates universal human goods in creative ways that could more correspond to its distinctive circumstance. Indeed, each nation is called by God to contribute in a particular way to the world's salvation. Though he is quick to point out the notion of a chosen people, referring to a particular nation, strictly belongs to the Old Testament, not the New. But hard questions remain. How should we understand post-biblical nations without rejecting that particular nation, Israel, whose election is woven in the flesh? Is Christian identity some strange third to be contrasted with, rather than related to, the nations and the Jewish people within divine providence? As in N.T. Wright's controversial summary of Pauline theology, what counts as grace, not race, claiming that Jesus was anti-nationalist, looking forward to a time when God, who saves individuals, not peoples, will be all in all? Will national histories be remembered, brought into the history of God, when the whole of history is seen in light of the life of Jesus? Early Christians wrestled with the charge that they had disturbed the way of classifying peoples in antiquity. They created Gentiles, adopted into a new universal ecclesia, men and women of the Spirit, a holy nation, and then made Gentiles unintelligible by preaching equality in Christ shatters all communities for those who have another city to love. A fictive, expanded kinship on the edge of time. This world, in its present form, is passing away, inventing, as one recent book on the Goy argues, a semantic field of individualized yet generalized ethne that destabilizes national distinctions, transcends ethnicity for exilic pilgrims on the way. Or to use language inspired by Agamben for these authors, nations are inoperative. They are as if not. The nations belong to the old age. Their telos is judgment. They are subsumed as undifferentiated Babylon. One res publica we know, of which all are citizens, the universe, declared Tertullian. In time, however, if Nigel is right, we live in social bodies of mutual reciprocity and collective self-governance that form distinctive vocations before God, with complicated relationships to ethnicity, language, history, and culture. Paul may have been all things to all people, but his mission as apostle to the Gentiles, even to the Gentiles, Paul, who was surprised by the hospitality of the Barbaros in Malta at the end of Acts, suggests that Paul does not jump out of temporal existence into an unmarked universal humanity, a Gnostic pretense of bodily eternity and diasporic homelessness. The God of this Jew from Tarsus who claimed Roman citizenship is, of course, also Isaiah's and Amos's God. In the Hebrew Bible, we find the prophetic vision of God bringing justice to the nation. As a light to the nations is Israel. The defeated nations count for nothing, Isaiah says, from the perspective of eternity, a mere drop in the bucket, a little dust on the scales of divine judgment. And yet, when God gathers all flesh before the divine, it is as nations they assemble, the turning of the 70 nations, the gathering of the 12 tribes. The psalmist declares the princes of the nation shall assemble with the people of the God of Abraham. Zechariah imagines nations will be a clan in Judah. The banquet of Isaiah pictures all the nations assembling as the sovereign Lord wipes away every tear. The nations will bow down before the true God of Israel and make reparations for what they have done. In their canonical form, the judgment against the nations is set within the eschatological context of their redemption, streaming to Jerusalem. By emphasizing the Jewishness of Jesus and the New Testament, recent biblical studies challenges any simple thesis that Christianity is universal and Judaism is particular. Even Paul's radical Jewish apocalypticism, according to readers like Paula Fredrickson, imagines adopted Gentile Christ followers of this cross-ethnic outreach join with Israel, but they never join Israel. In her words, they are reformatted ethically, but not ethnically. We always remain Jews and Gentiles, even in our transformed bodies. I have a colleague who works on visions of circumcised and uncircumcised angels in the eschaton. Now, later Christian tradition, to varying degrees, adopted this corporate language. Augustine has over 4,000 references to gentes. I didn't do what Chuck does all the time with those fancy numbers, but there was a telling description in Contra Faustus of Noah's Ark prefiguring the church of all nations. The distribution of nations, even assigning angels to nations with their appointed times in history and boundaries, Acts 17:26. In the words of O'Donovan, divine providence has instituted distinct peoples with distinct identities to set limits to the pursuit of justice. We know the toxic use to which this thinking is put. Acts 17 was a favorite verse of lost cause segregationist theologians in the American South, a favorite verse of the pro-apartheid Dutch Reformed Church, a favorite verse of Pastor Robert Jeffress, who on Inauguration Day preached the sermon for Donald Trump, citing it and Nehemiah, hoping he would rebuild the walls of the nation and restore America to a divine mission. Nations can become prisons of the soul unless you subordinate them to the God of all creation, a theme picked up in Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King. However, we are to read the historical Paul. Nigel argues nations are historical constructs, contingent, evolving, transitory. They are aching to be secularized or desacralized in that Augustinian sense. Following Barth, the nations are not located within the order of creation as essentialized natural kinds. They are stripped of primordial status, demythologized, dethroned of demonic pretension. Here we have the prophetic no that may satisfy most Christian critics of nationalism. Nations qua nations are no longer theologically interesting, other than perhaps as sites of moral injury and trauma. They are not part of the order of nature nor the order of grace. They are mere legal fictions. However, in a Barthian-style dialectic, Nigel writes, in another sense, nations are natural, insofar as their customs and institutions incarnate a particular, perhaps distinctive grasp of the universal forms of flourishing, suitable to our human nature. So nations are socially constructed, but real features of our world. They're not just in our heads. None of us have lived in a world where nations don't matter, affectively, cognitively, or politically. In a different idiom, drawing on Duns Scotus's account of individual essence as the perfection of a universal human essence, John Hare has similarly argued that a justifiable patriotism can coexist with moral cosmopolitanism. For Nigel, this does not mean national identity is merely constitutional. It needs to be cultural, a contested claim that gives rise to his views on controlled immigration, establishment, and a humanist public orthodoxy. Now, given time, I don't engage in these policy questions of prudential and principled judgment. As an American, of course, he is right about the first and the third, but not the second. What I want to do briefly is just theologize the spirit of Nigel's account that admits not only gratitude for civic institutions, but affirms a feeling of perceived kinship and shared culture. This challenges a familiar contrast, one that I used to invoke, between a benign civic nationalism and a xenophobic ethnic nationalism, as at least overdrawn. To be clear, not to emphasize some crude fixed notion of shared descent, let alone racial purity, but to recognize that political community generates and rests upon evolving, dense, ethnocultural, extra-political identities, typically rooted in language, history, and territorial continuity. But rather than turning to Herder, Burke, or Hegel, I suggest we go behind them to their sources in the biblical text. Many today note the role of the biblical text in constructing modern ethnicity and conceptions of racial difference in order to unmask and expose. My constructive suggestion is to step back from these critical purposes and argue that the very existence of Gentile identity should be a resource for Christian ethics. In August 2019, a number of prominent theologians published an open letter in Commonweal magazine against the new nationalism. It was critical of a national conservatism conference held in Washington, D.C. that summer, and a manifesto published in the journal First Things that it charged appears to eager to embrace nationalism as compatible with Christian faith. The letter invoked echoes of 1930s Germany and the Barmen Declaration and responded with a clear, firm no. Nationalism, it claimed, damages love of neighbor and betrays Christ by forging, quote, political belonging out of religious, ethnic, and racial identities, national loyalties, pretending to precede and supersede law. The better way, they suggest, is to affirm patriotism, not nationalism, and patriotism is marked by love of law. Now, many efforts in Christian ethics track these moves without much distinctively theological language, motivated by strong moral reasons. Yet they bear the trace of a Christian universalism wary of Jewish particularity, such that moving away from ethnic self-construction is taken to be a hallmark of Christian distinctiveness. The universality of Christianity, bursting what Adolf von Harnack called the bonds of nationality, is frequently celebrated. Yet it is an often unexamined characteristic, particularly of modern Protestant theology, that is being called into question by the dramatic rise of non-supersessionist theology and reading Paul within Judaism. Now, as a quick aside, I might mention we know now that John Rawls was a serious Christian thinker in his Princeton days, shaped by an Episcopalian personalism by way of his reading of Emile Brunner and Jacques Maritain, but also for at least a decade after his experience in World War II prompted his rejection of Christian orthodoxy. He taught an advanced seminar in Christian ethics in spring 1954 as a new assistant professor at Cornell, shaped primarily by a reading of Adolf von Harnack and C.H. Dodd. The mature Rawls has been blamed for defending the nation and also blamed for failing to do so. But in his senior thesis, with echoes of Kant, Rawls asserted that the universal fatherhood of God assails the pride of national groups. And in this seminar, he rejected on ethical grounds any account of the election of the Jews as a case of national vanity. And he celebrated the New Testament, cracking open God's covenant with Israelites to apply to all people in an ethical community. Now, given our political moment post-insurrection in the United States, I confess my sympathies lie much more with the Commonweal letter than the First Things manifesto. But both statements, I fear, reflect the impoverished language we have for these debates, beset by false dichotomies and lazy negations. Now, public statements are not the place for academic distinction-making, especially given the elusive character of nationalism, nation-states, national identity. Nevertheless, I think a default preference for good patriotism over against bad nationalism and bad ethnicity reflects a scripturally theological, problematic Christian anti-Judaism, unsure what to do with nationalism's resilience and its pedigree in the biblical and later Christian and Jewish sources. There's massive literature on patriotism. Some decry it as a form of group idolatry, an attack on the Enlightenment. Others defend patriotism without nationalism. Even Martha Nussbaum, in her recent book on the cosmopolitan tradition, admits that nations remain a unit of normative importance. Others have asserted the virtues of nationalism, defending its growth in Hungary, Poland, India, Israel, Brazil, post-Brexit Britain, Trump's America, as a return to a diverse legal arrangement at odds with liberal internationalism. Right-wing nationalism often presents itself as a form of decolonization, whether in India, US, or the Middle East. Since Nigel's book, there's also a growing archive of public-facing trade books that defend what has been called enlightened patriotism. Stephen Smith, in his book Against Latter-day Cosmopolitans and Resurgent My Country Right or Wrong Nationalist, charts a middle way in what he calls the age of extremes. He defends a Tocquevillian conception of American patriotism in primarily creedal aspirational terms. To be an American, he says, is to be engaged in asking what it means to be an American. He contrasts patriotism as a political virtue to nationalism, which is, by definition, exclusionary, tracing it to European Romanticism. And he targets the new nationalism of the right, but also, like Richard Rorty before him, the progressive left anti-patriotism that has become self-absorbed with an inward-looking cult of identity politics. Others, like Jill Lepore in her recent book, This America, The Case for the Nation, makes a similar case. Abandoning nationalism for patriotic liberalism, patriotism is animated by love, nationalism by hatred. Smith contrasts his vision from Habermas's constitutional patriotism by emphasizing the need to embody nations in particular histories and traditions. It's a habit of the heart, so to speak. But for the most part, Smith's patriotism is of ideas. In American Covenant, Philip Gorski has urged a new vital center, a rededication of the American Covenant based on a civic unity in our founding ideals. And he proposes several practical proposals to renew our civic holidays, character education, and national service. There's massive literature also on nations and nationalism, divided between those who hold the nation as an artificial creature of Western modernity, empowered by technology, states, and mass democracy, so-called modernists, and those who believe nationhood to be much older, more global, even deeply rooted in the human psyche, so-called primordialists, borrowing from the English sociologist Anthony Smith. I know a few Christian ethicists who engage this literature, though it appears in Nigel's book. Siding with a primordialist, yet also constructivist view, as I believe Nigel and I both do, need not deny that modern nationalism as a self-conscious political project is different than pre-modern ones, just as modern notions of race are different than pre-modern ethnicity. The Venerable Bede's notion of a gens Anglorum in the 7th century is not Luther's address to the German people in the 16th century, let alone Langston Hughes's Let America Be America again in the 20th century, or Putin's Russia in the 21st. Even the most traditionalists of the anti-modernist school recognize the fluidity and historicity of nations. But it is to draw a family resemblance that rejects the idea that nations are modern constructs invented for ideological purposes. Nigel is right. I think the roots of nations extend deeper than Benedict Anderson imagined, or those theologians today who long for a return to some Christian political tradition before nationalism. Let me draw to a close. Apart from disputed claims, historically, I believe this vision coheres with a biblical imagination that charges ethnicity and ethnic identification with providential significance, even when that identity is radically transfigured by the body of Christ. Now, the continuity and discontinuity between a biblical world that bound cult ancestors and ethnic deity and our own perhaps vanishing Westphalian world is, of course, vexed and complicated. But it's one reason why modern Christians do not think of themselves often as Gentiles, as non-elect, as adopted people who worship the God of another people. Recovering this sense of Gentileness in the meantime, when the gods of the nations are back, might speak to characteristic damages of this good of national identity, one that gives rise to parallels in secular thought wrestling with the so-called point of view from nowhere that has its skeptics on the right and the left. By my lights, one virtue of a theology of nations and a politics of internationalism, far from encouraging moral chauvinism, is the way it humbles pretensions by deferring the comprehensive perspective of eternity, allowing a retained specificity to press through calls for unity in Christ. A theology of nations can risk triumphalist providentialism and sinful exclusion, one reason why it fell on hard times after the 20th century. But it might also humble Christian ethics to come clean about the finite multiple sources of identity as people who have to think wisely about what it means to be a creature on earth, even as it maintains a theological voice. Or at least that is something I believe Nigel has done and asked us to do, to be faithful to the call of Christ. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 15 minutes for questions. It strikes me as interesting that we're meeting, given that last Sunday at the Cathedral, 800 years on from the 1222 Synod of Oxford, which resulted in Jews being expelled from England for several hundred years, was commemorated and has, attracted attention around the world. The Times of Israel, the Vatican reporting about it. Who would like to? Yeah.
Eric, thank you very much for a wonderful and lucid and far-seeing paper. Just one quick comment and then a question for you. This helps me understand a bit more of the interesting tension that people, especially in the United States on the left, have between the kind of ethno-nationalist and especially anti-Black racism of what they see as a rising nationalist right, and the way that that rising nationalist right ties that anti-Black nationalism also to a vigorous anti-Semitism. And the left doesn't know what to do with the anti-Semitic part of that. So that when the guys marched in Charlottesville, they were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And yet the UVA student associations immediately afterwards, who strongly came out in favor of a pluralistic and multicultural society and everything like that, refused to allow the Hillel group at the University of Virginia to join them, precisely because of this neuralgic tension you're identifying between the national and the cosmopolitan in this way, the national and the universal. And so that's interesting. I don't know that people on the left will want to hear that, but I think it's a really interesting tension you're identifying. My question comes to you about, in some ways, it feels like you're trying to reassert a category of the nation that can get behind the romantic moment. And I see you gesturing at that, but I didn't see any actual content at that. And yet I feel like there might be, but is the problem, in fact, that the difficulty arises not so much with the romantic concept of the nation, but maybe a pre-romantic concept of the nation, which is simply tied in the 19th century to a much more vigorous, much more powerful, and much more effective state than ever existed before. So that what happens is the modern state weaponizes the nation. The problem thus is not nationalism per se, but the political technologies we have vigorously in the 19th century to produce that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chuck. Two quick comments. I mean, I mentioned this as a change in my views. It's partly because I used to be very comfortable with the nation state and more not so comfortable with the nation because of that tie to the romantic moment. I mean, I think Herder is a little bit better than we often give him credit for. Jennifer Hurt talks about this in her book. It's not, I mean, leave Fichte to the side on this, but there is a kind of cultural pluralism that's also celebrated on the left, and so that is a tension that may be neuralgic. I think you're right about the powerful state weaponizing this. I've just been struck, and this is very complicated historical work, about the kind of enduring attention to natio and gentes and goyim in these pre-modern sources that are very different than what happens after the rise of the modern nation state. And what do we do with that? And it reflects this Gordian knot that many scholars, again, this is a sort of tribute to both Nigel and Oliver and to Regis Professor Christian Ethics that tries to be biblical. A lot of scholars have noted that the grounds of anti-racism are bound up in an ethical paradox that they often are at the service of an anti-Judaism. And how do we do one without the other? I'm suggesting that's what we need to think about, and that's why I want to put the nations back on the table of political theology, because I think it is true since Barth and since World War I and World War II, we've kind of collapsed nations into bad Naziist ideology. So how do we talk about national identity? And again, the fact that those nations seem to be still there in Revelation. I'm wondering, what do we do with that?
Yes. I should say we have 10 minutes for this section now, so if we can be fairly brief.
I'm interested in your bringing in the gentes, because in fact, if I understand the history correctly, the gentes were, although they could be referred to as tribes, but in fact, the, say, Merovingian and Carolingian empires that developed quite rapidly were empires with multiple gentes. But it was key that they had a unity of law at the top, which did not completely simply override the tribal laws, but tried to integrate them, and a unity of worship, one church, that was supportive and both supported and instructed, and was more universal than the people themselves. But the fact that the supreme lawgiver in the nation, in the polity, was the monarch, gave a personal relationship to the peoples, and which is completely sort of demolished in the state, the concept of the state, that it seemed to me did serve to preserve the cultural identities and the, one might say, somewhat mistaken familial character of things.
So, yeah, I mean, I've been pressing my real historian colleagues on a lot of these questions, as well as I press the biblical scholars who never give me an answer of how to translate ethne and how do we translate goyim, and etc. But I think the Carolingian example, I mean, even the question I've had is, yes, there is the kind of rise of the unity of law, a kind of judicial conception, but even as you mentioned, the unity of worship and some of the historical scholarship on the construction of Frankish and Lombard identity, that's one of the reasons why I've come to think that it's too easy to have a judicial conception of a civic nation that is detached from these ethno-cultural aspects that it always already is bound up with. Americans tend to like that because we think we're a nation not only dedicated to a proposition, but a proposition, without recognizing that it's funded by all these kind of under the surface aspects that we can, there's this huge, new turn to ethnicity in the pre-modern world, not as a scary term, but just as a kind of descriptive term of all the things you've mentioned. So I'm not sure the Carolingians are a counter to what I want to say. In fact, I'm sort of bracketing the question maybe of empire and nation here, other than to say the kind of ethno-cultural matters, and we don't know what to do with it today, especially when we privilege a merely judicial concept of political identity.
There are many questions, but Jennifer Hurt and then Nigel, I think.
Thank you. Just said touches on what I'm interested in here. I was just reading a book called Hellenicity. I don't know if you've come across that, but it's grappling with the formation of Hellenicity as an ethnic identity and focuses on fictive kinship as the heart of ethnicity. Interestingly, fictive, right? So there is on the one hand a strong emphasis on blood continuity, but it's fictive. And in the context of the formation of that Greek identity, on the one hand, there's been a strong emphasis on how it was forged in the context of war, right? So war brings people together in a fictive kinship of identity. And on the other hand, in migration, which is interestingly similar to the formation of the people of Israel out of this story of migration. And I just wondered if you have some reflections on the fluidity that emerges in that, right? So we have different units, like different nations, we could say, that become one nation through a story of migration, all of which they buy into, whether or not they actually migrated, right? But it becomes their narrative. Do you have a story about the composition of the nation and its fluidity, its decomposition, recomposition? What I heard you say was sounded more stable and something more settled, and the reality seems very fluid.
Yeah, well, I was maybe too subtle, and I was projecting onto Nigel a certain social constructivism, which not always is associated with Nigel, to suggest that there is this accent on the fluidity and the fictiveness of this, and the historical construction of it. So I'm sort of all on board with that. Bracketing Israel, I think that's a special case. But And I do think, I was talking to somebody the other day who's a postdoc in classics here. There is a sense in which the Greek tradition has a kind of more cultural sensibility, whereas Latin political theology after Augustine went in a more political analogy. That's something I want to start thinking about. But I do think, despite this, it's fictive but real. I mean, that's what we've learned from Sally Haslinger and all contemporary social theory, that everything is socially constructed, but it's no less real. I don't think we've theologized that notion of fluid, fictive identities that are real. I think the question I have is, are they only real temporally? Or what do we do with these fictive imaginary identities? I mean, Richard John Neuhaus famously said he was going to be American in heaven. I think I once asked Oliver if he will be English in heaven, and which is a complicated question, I guess, given his, but he said he would sing the Oxford Book of English Verse in heaven. So, these are fluid, constructed identities. But, I discovered I was American when I came to Oxford and studied here. So these are constructions and fictive.
How British I was when I studied in Chicago. So Eric, when I think about these things, I think out of my fate, my circumstances, my time of being born, and thinking, you have a different place and a different time, reacting against different things. So we're not likely to say the same thing. I'm really, when I read your paper, I'll figure it out for myself, but save me some time. Tell me, where do you think we differ most? Do we differ?
You wrote a book on the ethic of the nation. I'm asking you to write a theology of the nation. So I think the kind of asking you to adopt some perspective, I'm not necessarily to talk about Israel, but to talk about what it means to be a Gentile and the extent to which this turn to have a non-supersessionist theology matters for political theology. So I'm not sure we differ on that. You've been silent on it. There's not as much attention to what you think Paul. I think you do at one point in your article on immigration, you say that Paul transcends ethnicity and that the church is transethnic. Those are two different things. I think we have a multi-ethnic church for sure, but the extent to which ethnicity is transcended and sublimated and overcome, or whether it's just decentered, but we still, when I asked my colleague Cornel West, he's Christian, but that doesn't mean negating the fact that he's black. So how do we think about these identities? And I just think nationalism should be a part of that. So I'm not sure I think we are very much on board with the constructivism, but also the primordialism, and having those two. It's not just a modernist thing.
Thank you. There is much to discuss over lunch, but we now need to welcome Professor Kumar. So thank you very much indeed.
Well, my subject, as the last talk in this fascinating conference, is why should we be interested in empires? And in talking about this, I'm referring, of course, to a part of Nigel's work which has been mentioned occasionally in the last day or so, but not, I think, talked about very much. So I'm delighted to have this chance to discuss this aspect of Nigel's work, which I think has become very important in what he's been doing. I'm referring, of course, to the project that goes under the name Ethics and Empires. Nigel's been organizing, as many of you know, I think, a series of conferences over the last few years on empires and the ethical lessons or ideas that can be gained from looking at them. I'm delighted to say that Nigel brought me into this enterprise sometime between the second and the third conference. We're just about to have our fourth conference in about a month's time, and this will then be followed by a final one next year, after which we intend to produce some volumes of essays deriving from the conferences. So that's, of course, a very important part of Nigel's work. The other thing I think it's certainly important to refer to, all of you are aware of this, Nigel's forthcoming book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. which will be due out in the spring of next year. Now, I've been lucky enough to have seen some chapters from this book, and so what I'm going to talk about now in many ways reflects on what I think will become much clearer and certainly much more sophisticated when we have a chance to read Nigel's book more fully in the spring. I think I'm very much along the same lines as Nigel in thinking about empires, but of course I'm not going to try and go over what Nigel is going to be laying out in that book, which is specifically about the British Empire, and I want to talk a little bit more broadly about empires in general. So let me just state a number of different ways we can think about why empires might be worth studying. And the first way, I think, is to say that empires might be things that are good to think with. Empires are things that are good to think with. Well, use that expression that Claude Lévi-Strauss was very fond of, things that are good to think with. Why should empires be good to think with? Well, partly because of their very ubiquity, on the one hand, and also their diversity. To talk a little bit about their ubiquity, empires can be found in East and West. The Chinese Empire, on the one hand, say the Habsburg or the British Empire on the other. They can also be found in the ancient and modern worlds. In fact, they're so ubiquitous that the historian of empire, John Darwin, has called empire the default form, the default political form in human history. It's there right from the very beginnings of human civilizations, in that wonderful neck, the Mesopotamian area between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the whole series of empires that begin with the Babylonian, Assyrian, Akkadian, and then followed on by other empires in the area. We've had a whole succession of empires right from the very start of human civilization. And that story continues well into the 20th century. People talk about the era of empires being over now. I think that's a fairly open question, actually, as to whether extent empires are indeed simply history, or whether there isn't a life still there in various forms, even though, as we all know, empire has become a dirty word. Nobody calls itself an empire. That applies to America. It applied to the Soviet Union. It applies to contemporary Russia. Nobody wants to think of themselves or call themselves as an empire, but in many ways we can think that they are acting imperially, and that the analysis that we apply to empires might very well apply to them too. So ubiquity, that's one aspect, I think, of empires that makes them of importance to us. And the other one is diversity. And we can look at the diversity of empires in various ways. We can make chronological divisions, I think, of a fairly important kind, so that there are different types of empires at different times. I think two very influential cutting off points, chronological divides, are those empires that existed before what Karl Jaspers called the Axial Age, that period, roughly speaking, from about 700 BCE to about 200 BCE, when he says all the great world religions and ethical philosophies came into being. Interestingly, of course, he does not include the birth of Jesus or Muhammad in that axial age, because he simply regards those as offshoots of the Judaic prophets, probably probably correctly, but there are people here who know a lot more about that, so I won't say anything more. But there does seem to be a reasonable case for saying that the empires that come before the Axial Age and those that come afterwards are rather different in kind. The main distinction perhaps being that after the Axial Age you have empires as the carriers of world religions. Perhaps the most important and pioneering empire of this kind would be the Persian Achaemenid Empire, the one that was the carrier of Zoroastrianism, followed very shortly, and almost as a replica, the Empire of Alexander the Great, the carrier of Hellenism across the whole of Eurasia, and then a whole series of other empires that adopt the world religions as their mission. So that seems to me a very important chronological divide. And the other one, and some people perhaps think even more important, is the divide between Pre-Columbian and Post-Columbian empires. That's to say, the empires that existed before the European so-called voyages of discovery of the early 16th century. The Spanish, the Portuguese, followed shortly afterwards by the Dutch, the French, the British, and the others. That obviously establishes a certain kind of historical watershed, because we get from then on the construction of this global overseas empire. The ones that particularly the Portuguese and the Spanish pioneer, and then others copy them. But that does seem to be a very important divide, because most of the pre-Columbian empires are largely land empires. They're certainly much more restricted. They may have certain overseas aspects to them. I mean, the Roman Empire, after all, did cross the Channel and conquer Britain. So there is a little bit of an overseas aspect, and they were also incorporated North Africa, so at least they crossed the Mediterranean. But on the whole, most of the empires, including that of Alexander, are land empires. What the West Europeans did after 1500 in these overseas empires was something new. And I suppose the main novelty was the encounter with peoples that were in many cases not even known, not heard of, and how to deal with peoples of whom one had no knowledge whatsoever prior to the encounters. I think the incredible learning experience that we get from seeing what the Spanish did, particularly in the 16th century, how they thought and treated the indigenous people that they encountered in the New World, that seems to me one of the most important episodes of imperial history. There's so much to be learned because the Spaniards pioneered so much of how one should think about that. I'll come back to this question of what we might get from thinking about that experience. But that does seem to me a very fundamental chronological division, those empires that came before the European voyages of discovery and those that came afterwards. We can also add a couple of other forms of diversity. I've already mentioned the distinction between land and overseas empires. I think that produces different styles of empire. They have all kinds of implications as to the relationships between rulers and ruled. I'm happy to go into more detail about that later on if anybody wants me to do so, but I think those distinctions are important. There's also the interesting distinction between formal and informal empire. Distinction drawn, particularly, I'm glad to say, by somebody who was one of my tutors at St. John's College, Cambridge, Ronald Robinson, with his colleague Gallagher. Jack Gallagher wrote absolutely a fundamental article on the empire of free trade in the 1950s, which established that crucial distinction between aspects of empire that could be thought to be formal and those that could be thought to be informal. I think that distinction has continued to be of immense importance in looking at empires. It allows us, of course, to talk about a country like America as being an empire of an informal kind. It allows us to talk about the USSR, the Soviet Union as an empire, again, of an informal kind. Perhaps it allows us to talk about Putin's Russia today as an empire of, so far at least, mainly an informal kind. So my first point in why we should be interested in empires is that heuristically and pedagogically, they have a lot to give us. That is one of the reasons why we can get what we can get from the study of empires. Now, the second one is when we come to the second point, I think we're in much more difficult territory, much more controversial territory. And that is the question of how should we approach empires? By what standards should we judge them? And here I think we do come very close to the interest that Nigel has particularly had in empires, of not wanting to avoid this question of judgment. Now, I think David Hume was right to say that whatever people assert formally, judgment is as inevitable as sleeping and breathing. There are many accounts of empires that claim to be neutral, or to claim to be just descriptive, or just claim to be historical, and yet inevitably, by the very language, by the very form, by the selection that takes place, there are elements of judgment going into the ways in which empires are assessed. And I think we probably have to be much more explicit about that. We have to say, what is it about empires that we feel that we should try and find some criteria of assessment. Now, I have to say this goes very much against the grain of a good deal of writing on empires at the moment, when that very idea of judgment is vigorously repudiated by so many scholars. I give you a quote here from a book which I've just recently been sent to review by the TLS. It's a book by the great Russian historian of Russia, Dominic Levin. The book is called In the Shadow of the Gods, The Emperor in World History. And what Levin says is this. He says, there's no point in reading this book in a mood of sustained indignation that the past world did not operate according to contemporary political principles. Indignation needs to be suspended and the past to be understood on its own terms. I think that's a very conventional notion. Let's just understand the past on its own terms. Let's stand back. Let's not judge. Let's just allow the past to speak for itself. I have a second example, also from a very recent work, one of a rather more popular kind that many of you, at least in England, will be familiar with. The book called Empire Land, written by the journalist Satnam Sanghera. The subtitle is How Imperialism Has Shaped Modern Britain. I'm sure a work that Nigel is particularly aware of, because it deals with many of the same things that his own work deals with. And this is what Sanghera says. He says, he's talking here, he's reflecting on his own book. He has added a little sort of question and answer appendix to the Penguin version of his book. It is impossible to discuss British Empire in the 21st century, or even admit to curiosity or ignorance about it, without getting dragged into a binary consideration of whether it was good or bad. This is a stupid way of looking at the past, to read history as a series of events that instill pride and shame. I wanted to break away from this attitude and instead look at the effect of this vital part of our history on this country. Now, I have to say, having read about 2/3 of this book, I haven't quite finished it, he certainly does not follow his own precept in the book. The book is almost entirely a condemnation. I mean, he is a young man of Sikh origin who grew up in England, and the book is a series of sort of mainly autobiographical experiences indicating the hurtful impact of the British Empire on very many aspects of British society, particularly, of course, people of his own background. So even though perhaps he set off with the intention of being dispassionate and neutral about the British Empire, by about page 2, he seems to have given up on that endeavour. Now, of course, I mean, I quote those two as representative examples of what people are trying to say about empire. They want to certainly avoid doing what Nigel has been trying to do with empires, to think of the ethical implications of the experience of empires, what we can learn from them. That is something that people are obviously very afraid of. They're afraid of the implications of what might come out of that. So they prefer to stand back and say, well, we're not going to do that. We're simply looking at things from a purely objective historical point of view. And we might, of course, agree that judging empires by, or anything perhaps, by absolute standards might be unproductive. In the sense that all states, including imperial states, fail to live up to their aspirations and declared intentions. So on the basis of absolute judgments, all states would come out as having failed in having achieved what they were trying to do. So I think judgments have to be relative. And there are a number of ways, I think, in which we can try and conduct this exercise of relative judgments of the performance of empires. For instance, we might want to compare empires with other forms of state, particularly the nation state, which in many cases is seen as the natural successor to the empires, is seen as the principal antagonist to the empires, is seen as the things that brought down the empires in the form of nationalism particularly. How do nation states square up against empires in terms of how they've acted and what they've done? Now, we can do an elaborate calculation, I think, and no doubt some people have tried to do this. I simply want to say, as an indication of the way in which this needn't necessarily go against the imperial story, is to mention some of the activities of nation states, particularly in the 20th century. These successor states to the empires, how well have they acted in relation to their people and to other peoples? United Italy, United Germany, United Serbia after it had broken away from Yugoslavia, the nation state of Rwanda, the nation state of Russia after it had succeeded the federal state of the Soviet Union. I mean, when we think of those examples and what they have done in the 20th century, it seems to me that simply, at least as a first impression, empires don't come off that much worse than nation states. There doesn't seem to me anything necessarily intrinsic to nation states that's going to make them act in ways that are better than the ways that empires have done. And if you ask for the assessment that come from particular groups, such as the Jews, they would be very clear about their relative experiences of empires and nation states. For the Jews, thinking back to their times in the empires, particularly empires like the Ottoman Empire and the Hamsburg Empire, these for them are golden ages, as they often say, in terms of the tolerance that they experienced in those empires. I would say even in the case of the Russian Empire, which is often seen as ones where they suffered particularly badly from pogroms, but their experience in those empires was infinitely better than it has been in most of the nation states that succeeded them. So that seems to me one way in which we might think about assessing empires, is to compare their performance, compare their behavior with that of other forms of states. And then we might do what we might think of as an internal form of comparison, comparing different empires relative to each other. Empires compared to other empires. So, for instance, the British to the French, or to the Dutch, or to the Belgian, or to the German. And one of the ways, perhaps, of judging that, again, one could do a very elaborate comparison of these different empires and try and work out which ones one felt had performed best. I mean, I think one very interesting example of that would be something like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which is not really about, I mean, it's often discussed as a work about empire generically, empire in general, but he makes it very clear in that work that he's distinguishing between empires. He talks about the British Empire, in which he says some good work is being done. And for those of you who know Conrad, there can be no higher praise than some good work is being done. He does not use elevated language for praising. So the British Empire comes out quite well, according to Conrad, and of course the Heart of Darkness is set specifically in the Belgian Congo. And not that it necessarily relates only to the Belgian Congo, but clearly we can make distinctions here, and Conrad certainly does, between the performance of different empires. I think we can also look at the record of decolonization. How did empires end? What was the story of how empires came to an end? And I think on that basis, and again this is a fairly conventional judgment, but I think it's a true one, the British come out rather well compared, say, to the Dutch or the French. That might tell us a little bit about what kind of empires they were running by comparison with the British, but I think there's no question here. And here I think one would want to argue very much against the kind of work of somebody like Caroline Elkins. She's just brought out a new book. She's the one who became well known for her work on Mau Mau in Kenya and the British treatment of the Mau Mau prisoners. A very, very important work in indicating the extent of the atrocities that were committed in the Mau Mau detention camps. But she's just come out with a more general book called Legacy of Violence, which is just an entire kind of screed against the British in almost every conceivable way for the way they ended their empire. That almost every episode that she considers is one in which it's a tale of atrocities, unlimited, more or less. I think that kind of story doesn't seem to me to ring true. Again, it's selective in terms of the episodes it chooses. Nobody is trying to give the British a completely clear record on this, but again, it's a relative judgment in terms of how empires ended and how groups came out of them. And on that basis, I think one could hold to the view that the British come out relatively well. Now, in my own work, just to say how I came into empires, I've been interested in the management of empires, and particularly the management of diversity. All empires are, by definition, multi-ethnic and multinational, and they're all faced with the problem of how to manage this diversity. And here again, we can make comparisons between the empires on how well or how badly they managed this question of diversity. I think the Ottomans and the Habsburgs come out particularly well. Again, often for reasons that are very well known. The Ottomans were their famous millet system in which different religious communities were able to organize their own lives. Particularly the Muslims, particularly the Jews and the Christians, treated as peoples of the book by the Muslims of the Ottoman Empire. I think the Habsburgs also come out particularly well here. In their case, it's more a deliberate policy of allowing and accepting historic traditions and languages to exist. more on a pragmatic principle of divide and rule. They found it, I think, more convenient to manage their empire by allowing the continuity of different traditions and customs, rather than by trying to impose a uniform one across the whole empire. It suited them to set checks against Germans and Slovenians, against Hungarians and things of that kind. That was a form of divide and rule, which the Habsburgs, I think, practiced rather well for a good deal of their history. But it did have the effect of keeping alive many of the historic traditions of the different groups that belonged to the Habsburg Empire. We could also compare the British and the French empires on this aspect, the question of managing diversity. The British, on the whole, preferred to go in for indirect rule, of a Lord Lugard-style indirect rule. The French tended to go more for assimilation, to make their subjects, wherever they were, whether they were in North Africa or in Vietnam or in West Africa, more like French people. I think both have their strengths. I don't think the assimilation policies of the French were necessarily worse than the more indirect approach of the British. They both have their strengths and their weaknesses, but I think this is one of the ways in which we can consider the different experiences of different empires in relation to this problem of the management of diversity. The last thing I think I would want to say about why we should study empires is to mention the fact that in nearly all the empires, there's a critical tradition within the empires themselves, virtually from the very beginning. In other words, there's a kind of internal debate that has always gone on within the empires, which indicates that the story is much more interesting than it's often presented as, where it's often presented as a kind of a top-down imperial rule over subject peoples. It's the debate within the metropolis itself, within the imperial metropolis itself, that's often one of the most vibrant parts of the argument. And this goes back right from the very beginning. I mentioned the Spanish experience, the great debates at Valladolid between Bartolomé de las Casas and Sepúlveda about the treatment of the Indians in the New World. A wonderful series of debates, a degree of sophistication which I think was never bettered by anyone after that time. And what's so interesting also is that Bartolomé de las Casas won the debate in defending the Indians, in arguing that the Indians were human and were open to Christian conversion, that they could not therefore be enslaved, that there was no right of the Spanish to enslave them. He won that debate, and to the extent that it actually changed the policy of the Spanish crown in the way that they treated the Indians in the second half of the 16th century. So figures like that seem to me very important in the history of empire. In the British case, one has people like Edmund Burke in the 18th century. Who would not want to have Burke on their side in any debate? Or the liberal commentator J.A. Hobson, who wrote perhaps the most important book on empire, Imperialism, in 1902, highly critical work, from which the entire Marxist tradition of criticizing empire derives from the work of this liberal journalist, J.A. Hobson. In France, there was Jean Jaurès, the socialist, and there were sort of even more radical figures like Annie Besant, who adopted, in effect, a kind of Indian identity and cleaved to the Indian nationalist movement, became, in fact, the president of the Indian National Congress at one time. These are all, it seems to me, important figures in the history of empire. And they are all figures that come from within the metropolitan area itself, rather than being figures like the famous anti-colonial writers such as Frantz Fanon, of of course, one takes those writings as important critiques, but they're coming from the outside. I think just as important are the critiques that are coming from within the empires inside, because of course they often have a greater bearing on the policies. They can influence public opinion in a way that the voices from outside the metropolis often can't. I think I'm very struck by a comment by the Indian historian Sunil Kilnani, in a review of this recent book by Caroline Elkins, Legacy of Violence, which, as I say, really goes over the top in its condemnation of the British in their form of decolonization. He says, he reminds us, he says, liberal thought has been a resource for repression and resistance alike. Liberal thought has been a resource for repression and resistance alike. Many people have stressed the repressive aspect of liberal thought in the liberal theory of empire, but I think Kilnani is right to also bring out the resistance aspect of it. And I'm again struck by two things. One, again, I think works that Nigel is very aware of, since he crossed swords with one of them, Shashi Tharoor, in his book Inglorious Empire. I know that Nigel debated him at the Oxford Union on a famous occasion some years ago. Shashi Tharoor's Inglorious Empire, which is almost entirely a kind of condemnation, a damnation of what the British did to India. But I find it very interesting that half the critical points that Tharoor makes about the British in India, he draws from critiques written mostly in London in the early 20th century. He draws liberally from accounts by various English writers, commissions of various kinds, some of them coming from the Labour Party, but they are voices from the metropolis. And Tharoor can quote these, and they're extremely well written and extremely critical of what the British are up to. He doesn't really have to add very much to what they're saying to draw the conclusions he wants to about the awfulness of the British in what they did in India. Similarly, again, to refer to this book by Satnam Sangara, Empire Land, again, rather like Tharoor, he spends most of his time condemning the British Empire. But he too, quite rightly, in giving an account of what he calls imperial looting, the way in which after certain episodes the British allowed the troops to loot the treasures of the places that they were involved in. Just a minute?
Yes.
Yes, okay. For instance, I mean, the examples he gives are the looting that took place after the Young Husband expedition to Tibet in 1904, the sacking of the Summer Palace in Beijing following the Second Opium War in 1860, and the raid in Abyssinia in 1868. These were followed by quite extreme episodes of looting on the part of the British troops. And the condemnation at home was immediate and vociferous, in Parliament, in the press, and in public opinion. And to his credit, Sangara quotes liberally from these expressions of outrage on the part of the British public at the activities of the troops on these episodes. And so I quote these sources because these are two writers, Tharoor and Sangara, who are explicitly hostile to the British experience of empire, and yet nevertheless, to their credit, allow these voices to speak. So perhaps I can pause there with having made, I hope, some case for why empires are of continuing interest to us, or should be of continuing interest.
I know that there will be people wanting to ask questions, so we have just under 10 minutes for those. Matt.
Thank you so much for that. I have a variety of questions. I think one is, as you were doing comparative claims, you focused on how empires end. Why not focus on how empires begin? Because it seems like there could be harder judgments that would be made around the beginnings of empires. Is it possible for an empire to begin justly, even if an empire might end better than another empire? So I think that's one question.
That's a good way of thinking about it. We do know that some empires were clearly formed by direct conquest. I think one could take the Spanish Empire, the early 16th century, where Cortez and Pizarro go and they conquer the Aztecs and the Incas, and the Spanish impose themselves directly, as compared, say, to something like the British Empire, which is a kind of case of more of evolution, privately pioneered by corporations and individuals who set up colonies, and then the British state gradually takes over, sometimes very, very late, as with British India. I mean, the East India Company formally were in charge until as late as 1858. So there are different ways in which these empires began, and it might be interesting to consider origins as well as ends. You're quite right. It might be an interesting way to compare the different forms in which the empires came, as to how that affected the character of those empires. Because I think, although origins don't determine destinations, I think they often have a lot to do with the way in which things evolve.
In your paper, you asked the question, by what standards do we judge empires? But most of the questions I then heard you ask sort of presumed normative standards rather than explicate normative standards by which we judge them. Is there anything more that we can say other than, the only thing I think I heard you say was that there's no absolute standard by which we can judge them? Is that the most we can say, or does your viewpoint presume certain goods or values, or what are the ethical or moral or theological commitments that go into that assessment?
I've never myself tried to draw up a list of the ways or the criteria for judgment, because as with most people, I didn't come into studying empires with that in mind. It's something that's really evolved, and again, partly through my involvement with Nigel's project, I've become much more conscious of this aspect of empires and become much more interested in it. I think from what you will have judged, you will have seen from what I've said, that things that I'm particularly interested in things like toleration. Which empires and in what ways were empires able to allow different groups to express themselves without a kind of homogenizing of their cultures and of their ways? So toleration seems to me an important aspect of empire. I think there may be other things of that kind that one could add to the list of what empires were able to do. I mean, I'm actually very struck, since we've been talking about nations and nationalism in the last session. I'm very struck by the extent to which empires themselves are often the creators of nations. Now, whether that's good or bad is again another question, or partly depends on how we assess nationhood. But I'm really struck by the extent to which, for instance, the Hamsburg Empire, so many of the nations of the Balkans and those areas around them had no nationhood before the Habsburgs gave them a certain definition. We have a wonderful example in the case of the Soviet Union of the ways in which they deliberately created nationhood among certain Central Asian people who had basically been tribal or nomadic before. That nationhood then served as a political form for those groups after the breakup of the Soviet Union. But it was the Soviet Union that created them. So I think that might be an aspect of imperial life that's worth considering more than it has been, because usually nations and nationalism are seen as antagonists. They're hostile to empires. But I think there's another aspect to this story in which empires, if not exactly deliberately creating nations, have given rise to nations. The operations of the empires have given rise to nations. And so, in a sense, they've created their own successors. You might say they dug their own graves, but anyway, they created their own successors.
Is it possible to avoid appealing to utilitarian arguments in this context? Greatest good for the greatest number. There are all sorts of objective measures that can be applied: population growth, welfare, questions of health and survival over time, the accumulation of incomes, the introduction of factors of economic growth. Is it possible to avoid referring to those in reaching a judgment about empires?
You mean to assess to judge empires as a way of judging empires in terms of what they did for the peoples that they ruled? So, say the British in India, something like that. Is that the question? Yeah. People have tried to do that. I mean, the accounting exercise seems fiendishly complex to do it. I mean, Shashi Tharoor in this book, Inglorious Empire, tries to do something of that kind, and not surprisingly comes out with the view that the British got a lot more out of the empire, out of India, than India ever got out of the British Empire. So you can do this kind of accounting exercise, I think, for it. I don't know whether there's been any general conclusions drawn from that, because there's never been any consensus. It's even been impossible to decide on whether, say, the British got more out of their empire than whether they spent on it. It's been impossible for any agreement to be reached, because the ways in which the calculations are made are so incredibly complicated. Of course, it depends on what you put in, and people can't agree on what to put in and things. I'm not sure that kind of exercise is going to be very profitable, because I just think it's so difficult to do. But maybe some things could be done of that kind to try and assess the value of empire.
We have time for one final brief question and response, and then we'll have our thanks.
Thank you very much. Very quick question. First, how would you give us a definition, your own definition of empire, a formal definition of some sort? And then, what do you think about critiques like the Wenger-Graeber book that just came out, or the Savage book? I've always bought the Darwin line that empire was in some ways the default condition, but a number of people are now arguing for another version of kind of more organic democratic structures.
Well, the first one on definition, I mean, I suppose. Rule over a multiplicity of peoples is a working definition I've always gone with. I mean, the formal definition is that empire, at least from the Latin, imperium imperator, they were commanders in the field. So absolute authority, absolute sovereignty is the first meaning of empire. But then even under the Romans, it became a large state ruling over a number of different peoples. And I think as a working definition, that's perfectly okay. On the second question, you were saying about, can you just
Wenger and Graeber wrote The Dawn of Everything, or the Savage. They're more anarchists, and then Savage, I think, is more of an economist. And they both argue for coordination rather than governance as the primary mode of human sociality early in history. I don't know if you haven't looked at this stuff.
Well, you mentioned the Darwin view about the default position of empire, and I think we can agree that the form of empire, as I just defined it, can be found right from the dawn of human civilization up to the 20th century. So in that sense, it seems to me an incredibly wide-ranging experience across the entire planet. And that's what gives to me, that's the strength of this kind of studies. You've got such an enormous range of examples to draw upon at different times and in different places. And there's enough commonality, I think. One can show similarities and commonalities between these things that we call empires, even when they don't have a word for it. The Chinese don't have a word for empire, apparently. They borrowed it from the Japanese, who borrowed it from the West in the late 19th century. Like many of these words, they came in from the West. Nevertheless, it hasn't been difficult for Chinese scholars, having now got the word, to say, yes, we had a 2,000-year-old empire, and to do a lot of wonderful work on the 2,000-year Chinese empire. So I think that experience is a general one, which we can find objective indices of it across the world and across time.
Oh, well, listen to that.
Well, I believe lunch is present, and it wasn't in the program, but lunch will be served out here as soon as we conclude. So we'll keep our final words brief, but there are a few final words that should be given. First, grateful for everybody's participation in this very dialogical conference. It's one of the great values of the McDonald Center conferences, both the structure and the size, is that we can engage in, I think, free-flowing dialogue in the sessions and then certainly out of the sessions. And I, for one, am very grateful for friendships new and renewed in the last couple of days and for conversations and connections, and I hope that has been your experience as well. Thanks to our sponsors for the conference, Peter McDonald and the McDonald Agape Foundation and Mark Levesque and Providence Magazine. But before I say a word of gratitude to our speakers, I want to say a very special word of thanks to Jenny Dunn. Jenny is, yes, Matt and I's co-convener of this conference and a co-convener of a conference I was involved in helping with in 2016, but I think Jenny has been the co-convener of every conference and every event and every forum of the McDonald Center. The conference is, what's that? Co-convener, I was getting there, but yes, co-convener of Nigel as well. She's in the back. She is Jenny. So we all owe her a debt. Those of us in the Christian ethics community here at Oxford owe her a special debt. I mean, the fact that we can so easily call it a Christian ethics community, and that no matter what college we are all associated with, we associate the home of Christian ethics at Southwest Lodgings, is largely due to Jenny, whether it's hosting us American students for Thanksgiving dinners every year, or driving and preparing food for the escapades that Nigel has taken several of us on, including a memorable one with Chuck and a few others to Belgium and France and war sites, or Jenny's open table for so many students over the years just to listen to them in times of grief and celebration and crisis, all with her usual laugh and care. I think we all owe her a real debt. So to Jenny, thank you very much. And you can all express your personal gratitude to her in a second. Finally, speakers, we are all indebted to our speakers who made their way here, though coming to Oxford is never a hardship. We are grateful for the efforts that they put out. And I think each one of them admirably fulfilled their remits with the kind of careful analysis and erudition we have come to expect of each of them, and really was the cause for which we asked them to come. So a huge word of gratitude, and if you'll express your thanks with me to our speakers for this conference.
The aim of the conference was, that we asked our speakers to do, was to develop constructive and creative work that developed and expanded or departed from Professor Bigger's own views, but in ways that would enable us all to judge better and be more faithful in our vocations, not only as Christian ethicists, but wherever we are, as those who sometimes carry heavy burdens, to honor the faith that we are, as we heard. It's a wide variety of spheres, questions, and it raised a wide variety of discourses. But I think that's a tribute to the person who this conference has honored and the wide scope of his work. So we're grateful to all of the speakers for sure, but we're especially grateful to Professor Bigger one final time for his work as a Christian ethicist, as a mentor, as a leader of the community here in Oxford and beyond, and for his many years of service to the discipline and the church. Thank you, Professor Bigger, for all your work. I will also say, it's been a very meaty conference, and we look forward to publishing the essays of this volume, to which you will be able to return in some format. But if you can't wait until that happens, the videos will be up in about 2 weeks on the McDonald Center website if you want to view them again or pass them along to friends.
Go away. Stand up.
Once a student, always a student, I suppose. Yes, sir.
Please. Just three things. First of all, the occasion of this is my imminent retirement. Just to let you know, I don't use the word retirement. I plan to change horses. This post will end. My vocation continues, and so does the work. After August 31st, or after September 31st, my wife and I will move out of the Southwest Lodgings to somewhere else in Oxford. I will retain some status in the faculty and the faculty email. Watch this space. So this is the end of a phase on me. Secondly, you'll understand this occasion has been very personally gratifying. I take it you wanted it to be so. My vanity is purring right now. But getting past me, and I can do that. I'm really proud to have been the occasion of a gathering like this, where fine papers are delivered, where colleagues can talk in good faith, expecting good faith, and can talk frankly and freely. You may notice this is not always possible in the Academy these days. We've always done that in the McDonald Center, and this has been a fine instance of that, and I'm glad to have been its occasion. I also want to thank, and we've thanked the speakers, but thank you, all of you, for having engaged with my work. Critically, some of you have unkindly reminded me of where I need to think again, not least on human dignity or intentionality. Some of you reminded me of what I haven't said yet, or not enough, on theology of the nation. Don't quite understand that, I'll come back to you later. I thought I was being theological, but clearly not enough. I was thinking last night, I was aware, having done it, my presentation last night was perhaps surprisingly biographical, and I was reflecting on why I did that. I think it's because I take it for granted that we all speak out of certain faiths. We therefore focus on certain questions. We're inclined to give certain answers. And of course, whatever we say is limited. There are certain things I don't pay attention to. Certain things, certain truths I don't speak. And I forgive myself for that because I can't. I'm a creature. So I'm liberated to speak the truths I think I should speak. And therefore I expect other people to speak different truths. And that's why we need a community of people who trust each other enough to correct each other and supplement each other. Yeah. So I'm glad we've achieved that here and hope that that will continue in the McDonald Center in years to come. So colleagues who have engaged, thank you for comprising that community, and let's carry that on. Finally, Matthew Anderson, Brian Williams, this was entirely their initiative. I didn't prod them, I didn't ask them.
Sure.
I did give some advice, that was it. So the responsibility is entirely yours. I think it's been a great success. So I want to thank you personally, but on behalf of the rest of you, I'm sorry, I do this because partly lack of sleep, partly partly occasion. Occasionally my inner Edwardian, my natural stoicism just
I can't help it. It's my fate. That's all right. So yeah, that's okay. So thanks a lot. But on behalf of the rest of you, I want to thank Matt and Brian and again Ginny. And if I could clap, I would. But please, would you clap to express your appreciation?